I am delighted to welcome to you our first interactive seminar on incident response preparedness. Today, I'm joined by Steve Giacardi, who's going to introduce himself in a second, but just a couple of sort of things to talk about before we go live. So if you've got any questions today, there's a text box up to the left. You just ask questions in the text box, and our team will go do their best to get through that, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end so you can go and interact with us and have that kind of conversation. We have a lot to talk about today, but before we go into that, I'd really like to talk about who I am and what I do. So I'm, as I said, Stuart Peck. I head up cybersecurity strategy, head up the education and training side of the business, lead incident responder. So I've done lots of incident response work all over the world. Lots of different companies want to share some of that experience. Also head up the governance, risk and compliance function, do a lot of work around open source intelligence and social engineering. And actually have been included in the book, The Tribe of Hackers Blue Team, where I'd actually written a whole sort of section on incident response. So hopefully share some of those learnings with you today. But of course, this session wouldn't be possible without my esteemed colleague, Steve Giacardi. So Steve, did you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Giacardi. I'm the Information Security Manager here at ZeroDayLive. I have a background of sort of about 20 years, different IT, hands-on IT experience, doing support for first, second and third line. And I joined ZeroDayLive about 3 years ago to focus on information security. And I work with a lot of organisations, helping them get ISO 27001 compliance, look at their GDPR and their cloud and AWS environments, and ensure that security is embedded in the organisations.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. It's amazing. Okay, so let's talk about what we're here to discuss today. So first, we're going to talk about the incident response life cycle. We're going to talk about incident response preparedness. What is incident response preparedness? We're going to talk about differences between events and security events and incidents. We're going to talk about the documentation that you need for incident response. We're going to also talk about how you identify gaps in your incident response process, how to test that process, and we're going to do like a little talk through an incident as well. So quite a few things to talk about. And again, as I said, delighted for everyone here to be joining us, and welcome aboard. So the whole part of today is about preparedness, right? But there are different stages of how you prepare for an incident. First, you must look at the documentation that you prepare. You must assess how effective that documentation, the processes you are and the controls, and then you should look at testing that. And these are the three phases that we're going to talk about today in great detail. The first part of that is to look at the incident response lifecycle. That's NIST is a very good standard. There are other standards you can use or frameworks you can use to look at incident response from a preparedness point of view. But there are kind of stages that are really important. And the fundamental stage that we're talking about today is the identify. And the reason we're going to focus a lot on identify is because if you don't know what your critical assets are, or what assets you have, or where the critical data you have resides, or how those assets are connected, it's going to be very hard for you to protect those assets, especially if they're not included on, say, an asset register, for example. It's going to be very hard for you to then be able to detect because you won't have the appropriate monitoring in place to do that. It'll be very hard for you to respond because you'll detect something very late down the life cycle. And of course, if you haven't actually included those assets or identified those critical assets, you may not have the appropriate backup strategy in place, and therefore will be fairly hard to recover if backups are required, of course. So there's a lot of things to consider today. And so we want to talk about the importance of all these stages in how that helps you formulate that incident response plan, run books, all this kind of stuff that we're going to talk about. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about the incident response pyramid, otherwise known as the incident response pyramid of pain. And there's a lot of things that we, myself and Steve in particular, talk about. And this is a discussion we have quite a few times and over many late evenings. We've been discussing this for a while. And this is whether you look at your threats first or whether you look at your inventory and your asset register. And I know, Steve, you've got a couple of points on this.
I have. Thanks, Joe. I always think that for a business to be able to properly identify the threats that it's facing, it has to be able to understand the assets that it uses to be able to do the business that it's doing. And so for me, threat management and incident response preparedness always starts from having a good understanding of the assets within the organisation and then mapping the data flows throughout the business so that you can identify where the assets that you may not have realised are actually the critical assets and may need defending, and the assets that you thought were critical may not be as crucial to the flow of data through, and so may not need quite so much focus and attention.
So on that basis, we decided to put inventory and asset manager at the bottom. I did lose the bet on this one, so that's fine. But the most important thing here is about identifying those critical assets. Have you identified your critical assets? And then you can apply threat modelling and lots of other things to this to understand, okay, how would an adversary target those assets? Who would want to target those assets? Why would they want to target them? And this helps start to build up that model of, okay, how do we start protecting those assets? And then probably the most crucial stage in this process, if you've identified those assets, is your telemetry, your monitoring. So the analogy that we were talking about earlier, which is quite coincidental, is the whole, okay, you might have a building and you might have buy the best locks to protect that building, but if you then don't have CCTV, you don't know whether if someone breaks into the building, where they've gone, how they got in, so you can better protect your locks in the future. And then of course you won't have an understanding who it was or where they actually went after they broke in. So monitoring is vitally important, and this is something which is important. If you don't have visibility of your assets, then you can't defend those assets, or when your controls fail, you can't understand how and where and when someone was targeting them. Of course, then you can't detect that unauthorized activity. And if you can't detect that, then of course you're going to enter into that incident response life cycle very much further down the line, where it's going to be harder to contain, and therefore the impact could be much more significant. Triaging as well. We're going to talk a lot about triaging today and about how to classify detection results, and we're going to provide some techniques and some tips for able to do that. But of course, being able to accurately classify the information to understand what decisions the business needs to make is vitally important. And then of course being able to correlate that information. So if I know that this indicator of compromise was IP addresses or file hashes, or this DLL was compromised or used, or this binary was modified, and I know how that was done, I can then start to look at the rest of the organisation to see if this was a single instance of something happening or whether this was much more widespread. And of course, baselining, which we're going to talk about later, is so vitally important. Can you differentiate the adversary activity from the normal behaviour? But if you haven't baselined, then very much probably not. Right? And of course, going into that adversary that's already embedded. And all these later stages fall back down to kind of three core principles. Have we identified the assets? Have we identified the critical assets? Do we know what we're looking to defend from? And then can we see that happening in real time or near real time, or do we have the visibility? And this is going to be quite important, especially later on in this session. How do we prevent, detect and react and respond is determined by the greater levels of visibility that we have in the organisation and the processes that we have defined as part of that. So we're going to talk about all of this later. But before we do that, the question that everyone asks is, why should you prepare?
Because it's almost inevitability that an organisation is going to suffer an incident of some kind. I mean, if we look in the news today, we can see the Colonial Power Company over in the States who suffered a ransomware attack last week. And I think it's really good to notice that the first steps they took once they determined that they were under a ransomware attack was that they disconnected the devices that had been compromised to try and contain the attack as it happened. And so even though the consequences of that are immense, the fact that they had a plan in place to understand how to respond to the incident when it occurred helped them to mitigate the effects of that incident within that environment.
And to your point, and it's really good they did that, there's this unintended consequences, and I see this quite a lot. And also I'd like to kind of bring up another point which is related to that, is that if you have a plan, then you have some kind of formulatic way of responding. You have a guide, you have reminders or something, a process to follow. It's when you don't have a plan, is when you're reacting to that breach, and you're finding yourself being much more chaotic in your response, and that can lead to mistakes being made or things being missed. So having a plan and keeping that maintained, and back to the principles we talked about earlier, is vitally important. But it's much more than just having a plan. There's so much more to incident response preparedness than just having a plan. But it is fundamental that you have one, right? So we're going to talk about that, and we're not going to talk about statistics because every presentation has statistics, but we do know that, there is inevitability within having an incident, and it's how you manage that incident is how effective you are in reducing the potential impact by detecting things a bit earlier in the life cycle. Which brings me on to our first step, prepare. And it's over to you, Mr. Giacardi.
Well, as we discussed, we have to have an understanding of the assets within the organisation, to have an understanding of what it is that we're protecting against. But when you're talking about a business, the business also has to be aware of that wider environment. So you have to look at the things that could have an impact. So you have to look at the economics, the political landscape, how things could change. And I think it's quite relevant that we're discussing this today, because if you think about the last year, the pandemic was an external influence on all businesses in the UK, and it's how businesses have reacted to that, which I think is quite interesting, in the fact that everybody has switched from being on-prem to remote. And whilst that's fantastic in the one sense that businesses are able to adapt to those threats that came from external, it has produced in and of itself a second threat vector, because you now have more opportunities for attack. So now businesses should be going back and updating their incident response plan to look at how they're going to respond and defend that, what they would call the expanded perimeter.
And actually, and one of the things that early in the pandemic, when I was doing incident response sort of preparedness work, was about the VPN. So the VPN is obviously a very, very big attack vector, and has been for a long time for ransomware groups, for example, right? Exploiting known vulnerabilities in third-party VPN systems. But also, if an attacker then takes down that VPN and everyone is based remotely, the ability to respond is, to that attack is massively affected. So having that kind of understanding of your external kind of influences in that process is vitally important.
Indeed, because the threats change day by day, and it's no good having a plan and just having that plan sit there, because then the plan can, what's the term, atrophy, and is no longer valuable and no longer relevant to the situation that the business now finds itself in.
So, which takes us into the topic of the day at the moment, which is understanding your assets.
Indeed, because from understanding your assets, you can then sit down and determine the threats that are likely to attack and cause damage to those assets. And I think it's key to understand that for us, an asset is anything that has value to an organisation and helps a business to produce the service that it delivers to its clients. So assets can be tangible things like the desks, the building, your firewall, all of your endpoints, and it can be intangible things like your intellectual property, your brand and your reputation. And by understanding the importance of those assets within your business, you can then determine the criticality of them to you as an organisation, which can then focus where you should spend to defend against the threats that you can identify that could harm and damage those assets.
And of course, that then feeds nicely into an incident response plan. If your detection and your prevention controls are circumvented or breached, then of course that changes what we need to focus on, which comes down to baselining. I mean, how do we go about baselining?
Well, this is one of the more difficult things that an organisation has to do, because you have to consider where you're going to baseline and what it is you're going to baseline for, and how you can then understand what normal looks like, and in order to be able to understand and recognise abnormal. So for me, baselining, I have to say, it starts with assets. You need to go back to your critical assets. You need to understand that those critical assets are hardened. And that means if, for example, we're talking about servers, have you closed down all the unnecessary ports? Have you removed any unnecessary programs? If we're talking about things like firewalls, are you aware of the traffic that's travelling through those firewalls? Do you know what traffic should be travelling through those firewalls? All of these things should be documented. There should be business cases for the ports that are open, so that if you then go to review the firewall logs at the end of the month and you determine that a port that doesn't have a business case with it is open, there's a process for you now to go and investigate what's going on with that. There are other things you can do as well for baselining, which is network analysing, having a look at the traffic that's passing across your network. The trouble is that I think was one of the clients that we've been working with, Stuart, I think we had 50 endpoints that we were looking at.
Yeah, so cloud services and some servers and firewalls and endpoint detection response type stuff.
And I think we were saying that there was something in the region of 604 6,000 million log files.
684 million logs captured in a month. These security logs as well.
Yeah, which is just an enormous amount of information to go through to understand what is an abnormal log and what's a normal log. So part of baselining, it has to be understanding which logs you should be looking at to determine where problems are arising.
And it also comes into, we were having a chat just before this stream, it also comes down to the fact that it's about understanding the assets, but also understanding the business process. So we have a joiners and leavers process. We know on a Monday that new users are added to a system, just for example, and on Friday we know that new people that might be joining the company or new people or people that might be leaving a company. So we have a process for knowing who's leaving and joining. We have a process for creating those new accounts. If we see an abnormality in that, it could be a legitimate business process, or it could be a potential issue for investigation. So having an understanding and appreciation of the business process combined with the assets and the connected assets and the traffic flow all helps you to understand that baseline. And it's not an easy exercise, by the way. We're not saying, oh yeah, just go do some baselining, it'll be absolutely fine. No, we're not advocating that at all. But having an appreciation for that and starting to build that knowledge up over time will make this a lot easier.
And again, this is where I think things like data flow diagrams and process mapping help within an organisation, because they help you to identify where those bottlenecks are and where those assets and critical assets are, and help you to be able to recognise when a process is taking place that is kind of off book.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this takes us into incident and events, right? So what's the difference between an event and an incident?
Well, pretty much everything that happens on a network is an event. So if you log into a computer, that's an event. If you receive an email, that's an event. If you open a file, that's an event. So events are just records of things that are happening within a network. Now, an incident is a number of events that could have a negative impact on the security triad, the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of an asset within a business. So incidents really are a combination of events that have a negative impact on a business. But not every incident is an event, but every event is an incident.
Can be an incident.
Yeah,
absolutely. I was going to say, because me typing on my keyboard probably isn't an incident, right? But we'll be okay with that. Right? And of course, there's certain incidents can affect more than one thing. So if you take ransomware as a potential use case for this, that definitely, depending on if they are exfiltrating data, but that can certainly affect the confidentiality of data. It automatically affects the confidentiality of the data because of the fact that overwriting the data with encryption, although encrypting the data, and it affects the availability because now you are denied access to that data. So it's kind of that perfect storm use case. Of course, there are many mitigation methods to kind of recover from ransomware, but now we've got things like data exfiltration, which makes it a little bit harder. So, there are different categories of events and different severity of events depending on what's affected and the scale of that. But of course, we're going to talk about that later. So, which is great. And of course, we have kind of talked about this already, but, incidents are, affecting the CIA triad basically, and these are things that we need to start thinking about when we've done that baselining, when we've done that business impact analysis, when we've done our run books and procedures and things like this. We start thinking about. So, what kind of documentation should we have, Steve?
Well, businesses should really have a security incident management policy, which should be a high-level document, which should detail both the primary and secondary incident response teams. And the reason you have to have, or you ideally should have, a primary and a secondary incident response team is because if members of the primary team are unavailable, you've got substitute members who can step in and fill the gap. The policy should direct people to an incident response plan. The incident response plan in turn should direct people to the relevant run books that can be used in the event of the incident occurring.
Absolutely, and the run books themselves, we talked about this earlier, they should be technical in nature but written in layman terms so anyone can understand this. Yep. And this kind of ties nicely into the fact the team, which we'll talk about later in terms of forming your incident response team, and how do you go about forming that incident response team, because we'll talk about it now because that's just quite relevant. One of the things that we were discussing earlier was about having a defined team. And we're talking about your technical incident response team and your executive team, but also having delegates. And why is that important, do you think?
Well, again, I think this goes back to asset management, and it goes down to having a good asset register and being able to assign ownership of the assets to responsible individuals. So you've got experts, subject matter experts on things like, for example, the data that's stored on such and such a server. And if you can involve the people that are responsible for the assets in the asset recovery in the event of an incident happening and make them a part of the security team that's going to be responding to incidents, you have expert knowledge about that asset and about the things that could be affecting that asset.
Yeah, and also having a backup, we all talk about backups and recovery and things like this, but also having a backup team, right? So like a scenario of, when you have a sport game, whether that's football, rugby, whatever it may be, a team sport game where you have your primary team that you're going to play on the day, and suddenly someone gets injured or whatever it may be, you need to bring on a substitute. It's very same with your incident response team. A lot of people just say, these are the people that are going to do the incident response, and these are the people that we've assigned to it, these people we've trained, and then suddenly they're on the plane or they're out the office or on holiday, and they don't have a fully trained up person.
Well, they can just be unreachable. They could just be on the tube when something happens and you can't reach them. So you do need to have somebody that can cover for them, who's been trained in recovering the organisation in the event of the people that are assigned to the team being unavailable.
And also, this is also about burnout prevention as well, which is a really important thing. If you are experiencing a very long, drawn-out incident, the last thing you want to do is burn out the team, because you have issues downstream with people leaving an organisation, for example, or something like that. So you need to have a backup team ready and almost put them on shift patterns so they can hand over or step in when someone else has been working like 5 days straight or something like this. So it's really, really important to have almost business continuity planning of your people during an incident in some respects. So let's talk about the policy, because I know we've kind of lightly touched on this, but let's talk about the policy.
Well, policies really should help the organisation to define the lines of communication, the lines of the process for escalation, and the management that should be involved to contain an incident. They should define the methodology that's going to be used within the organisation to resolve an incident. They should identify any third parties that you may need to call on to help you assist. So, for example, if you're a smaller organisation and all of your IT is outsourced, then you need to know who the contacts are in that support organisation to be able to bring on board in times of crisis. And I think kind of key is that the policy should also identify any legal or regulatory requirements that the business should respond to in the event of an incident. For example, most organisations within the UK should respond to the ICO in the event of personal data being breached, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very important. And of course, there are other regulations as well that you might need to look at. And of course, the plan. What's the importance of the plan? Well,
the plan should help the organisation because it will define who the members of both the primary and the secondary cybersecurity incident response teams are. This plan should include the contact details for all of those individuals, both emails and mobile phone numbers. It should define how the response plan is aligned with the business continuity plan. There should be consistent terminology across both the cybersecurity incident response plan and the business continuity plan, because having that common terminology simplifies the understanding across the business. Both documents should be clear and concise, and they should be reviewed on regular instances.
So you brought up a really interesting issue here as well, is that alignment between business continuity and incident response. They are one and the same, they're just two different dimensions, whereas business continuity and disaster recovery is about the recovery, the availability, whereas the incident response plan is about the confidentiality, integrity and availability, and you will always fail over to your disaster recovery business continuity plan. What's interesting as well is, we'll talk about this later, is about recovery, right? And making sure that you have tested your recovery efforts, because ultimately the one time you don't want to find out your disaster recovery or business continuity plan doesn't work,
or your incident response plan,
is when you're in a bit of an incident.
Correct.
So this is actually that time where it's go, right, we need to update this, but we'll update it maybe after we've actually worked out what's wrong with it.
And of course the incident response plan has to lead you to finding the correct runbook to help you deal with the scenario that you're now facing. And the runbooks themselves need to be really clear, concise documents, and I'm really advocate not using acronyms and other short abbreviations. Write them for people that don't have the technical background. Although they're technical procedural documents, always write them from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have that technical understanding.
Or someone who maybe in support desk who hasn't had the full training but needs to understand, would potentially have the steps to do this but isn't a cybersecurity expert, for example, right? So they can understand how to do it. And that is quite important as well. And of course, vitally important, like all of these documentation, regularly review. And when we talk about regular reviews, we're talking about, okay, we've had an incident, we've got subsequent, we've done the root cause analysis, we identified that these are things that we could do better next time. Make sure they get ingested into the plans and the run books and the policy to make sure you are doing that next time, rather than going, we'll think about doing it and we'll document it, but actually the next time you'll make the same mistakes because you haven't learnt from that. Learning and updating. So update them annually, or when there's a major change in business process or technology or whatever it may be, or after an incident. And hopefully you don't have to use them. These are one of the few policies that you hope you don't have to use. But if you do, they're there to help you through that process. So this takes us quite nicely onto, assess, right? And, this is something which is really important, because when we talk about incident response preparedness, we're talking about taking you through that process of understanding your policies, your assets, the process you're going to follow. And that's great to have that all documented and up to date. But as we said, you want to also understand what your capability is to respond. And this is kind of vitally important. And one of the ways of doing this is to look at, first of all, who's going to respond? Who's going to help us? Who has got the skill sets to help us where required? Who needs upskilling and training? And who are those people? And when we talk about the kind of people in this org chart that we have at the moment, this example in this response team org chart, we're talking about roles and functions, because people leave organisations, people change roles. So we need to identify the functions that we need, whether that's, in this case, at the bottom end, we're looking at sort of anyone in networking or third-party services, anyone in infrastructure, head of support, whatever it may be. These opportunities, people and functions that can support that technical response. And it's really important to have that documented and go through the organisation and go, okay, who operates in that team and who are the 2 or 3 people that are going to be primarily responsible for that? So who is usually a head of department and someone else quite senior in the team. And then also, who else should we train on this? Well, my answer is always everyone.
Absolutely. And I think, Stuart, that one of the benefits of looking at an org chart like this is that this can be directly mapped over the asset identification work that the business has been doing, which alongside its data flow diagrams has been the understanding of how information is being moved, processed, stored within the organisation, which assets. You can identify the responsible individuals as either the asset owners, the departmental managers, and then you can look at the people that support those people in those roles, and that's where you can start to look into the IT infrastructure team. So which members of the IT infrastructure team are responsible directly for looking after desktops, which ones are looking after network connections. And I think from having that understanding of your assets and understanding of how data's moving through the organisation, it almost holistically leads you to understand who's responsible by assigning ownership.
Absolutely, and of course, one of the things that we do when we do desktop scenarios and things like this, and I've done many of these kind of things before, and the kind of real gotcha in all these situations is you sort of turn around and you suggest that something's been compromised by something like ransomware or malware, or an attacker's got exfiltrated data from the system, and you go, well, what data's on that system? And they go, we don't know. Yeah. We think it's this. Yeah. Well, why don't you know? We think it's this because of these reasons, but is it not documented? Do you not know where your critical assets reside? So it does tie back to that, but of course, that's the question you don't want to be asked during a real incident, to go, we don't know what's on it, we have no idea, right? And that's kind of really important, because having that understanding, doing the fundamentals and understanding where my data resides, where my critical assets are, it will help you ascertain what level of response is required and how you respond.
And what security should be in place on that device, because there's no point focusing all of your, as we were saying earlier, there's no point focusing all of your defences on a server that just contains lists of everybody's pets. What you really want to be looking after is the server that contains all of the critical information. So part of that asset understanding is doing an information asset register.
Yeah, including it in your overall asset register, so you know what's contained within each of those assets.
Absolutely.
And so also, talking at the next part of this, so we wanted to define who's going to be incident manager. And incident managers could be, multiple people in your organisations. I'd recommend usually it's someone like a CISO or head of information security. It could be a head of IT. It's someone who's going to be able to translate the technical information that's collected from the cybersecurity and response team and be able to communicate that effectively up to your crisis management team at the top. And that's what's really important here. And your crisis management team is like your HR, CEO, whoever it may be, but make sure those people are equally trained and know their responsibilities during an incident, because there are going to be some critical decisions that are going to be made and tough questions to answer during those processes that enable the business to make those swift decisions.
Well, because they're the people really who are the gatekeepers of the reputation of the organisation.
Yep.
Because they're the people that will be interfacing with the general public, and how they portray and deal with the crisis and let the world know about what's occurring. Should that be required, they would have to have that understanding to protect and limit the damage being done at that level.
And also, if you want to get an understanding of how incident response is done well and where it's not done so well, just watch all the crisis management videos on all the incidents that have ever happened, and you can work out the ones that are really good versus the ones that clearly haven't had the incident response training and are kind of muddled for their words, and the information is not clear and concise and effective. And so there's a lot of things that can do, but having a good crisis communications person involved in your executive team, so someone who's good at PR, all that kind of stuff is really important. But prepared statements. So one of the things I always come across is the question I ask every time I'm sitting in front of executives is, do you have cybersecurity prepared statements for incident types? They'll have prepared statements for everything. Very rarely are there prepared statements for incident types for the execs to get out into the business. And that includes internal and external comms. And your internal communication planning is just as important as your external. But we'll talk about this later, because obviously we can move on from that. Oh, okay, we can't because it's doing that. Okay, so we talked about training, but the most important thing about training is making sure that you've identified the things we talked about, which is listed here, okay, and listing up here, and having a plan. We know about that, having a technical plan and non-technical plan. But the vital part of this process is practice recovery. And I can't explain it enough, and we talked about this earlier with the business continuity plan. You do your annual desktop scenario where you'll take your business through a BCP kind of desktop scenario, so the building's flooded, what do we do, and all this kind of stuff, and you walk through that process, and then you might actually do a full recovery exercise to later on in the year or something like that to test that your recovery efforts work. The same should be said for a incident, because you might want to practice, can we actually recover during that incident? Can we actually fully recover during that incident? And maybe we need to pick a few assets out and just test that as part of our annual BCP if we have one, right?
And one of the real benefits that one can gain from doing practice recovery is by not just doing it with the CCERT team, but by doing it with maybe 2 members of the CCERT team and 4 other individuals who would not necessarily be involved in an incident, but could be should the circumstances prevail.
Yeah, and the key thing here is, and we've identified this in other exercises where we've gone, well, actually, look, let's do like some kind of scenario where we're actually going to get one of our members to test your network to see whether we can get your backups, and if we can take your backups off, actually not take your backups off, but we can get your backups, and we can assume that the backup and recovery exercise could be affected. So now we took the backups off the table, and all of a sudden,
how does the business now recover?
So your business continuity plan is now completely taken off the table, because actually the environment that you had to recover in your disaster recovery site no longer exists. But then you have tape backups. But if the tape backup environment is encrypted and you've taken out the method of being able to decrypt your backups, all of a sudden your backups are offline. So please road test every scenario, your recovery efforts, because if you don't, the last time you want to test again your recovery efforts is during the middle of an incident where you realise they actually aren't quite as good as they maybe should have been. Which kind of takes me into like the capability. So we talked a lot about Process, we talked a lot about training, but there are certain capabilities you might need to review. So obviously making sure you've got your asset management up to date, you've got your plan and your policy and your run books. You need to train your people. It's really important. It's important.
I think it's hugely important that everybody within the organisation understands who they should report a security incident to. And I think it's also especially important to make people, encourage people to come forward and to report things, because something might happen on their device that they might consider unimportant and not worth mentioning, but it could be a precursor to something terrible occurring. So encourage everybody and make sure that all of your workforce know how to and who to report a security incident to.
And that should come through your security awareness training, your constant internal communications. That should be everywhere, right? Yeah. And your support desk, when you log a support ticket, you should make sure, is this an incident, or do you suspect this is an incident?
I can see all the support desk teams looking at me with hatred.
Yeah, well, but it's important, right? And this is really vital, because if you're not reporting incidents, then usually, if you look at the kind of usual suspects for incidents, it's going to be users reporting something. It's going to be third parties telling you there's an issue, and that's the one you don't want, right? It's someone else telling you you've got an incident, because that's usually quite bad. Law enforcement, or it's going to be your systems and your SOC, if you have a SOC or a managed SOC or whatever it may be. So, you are going to be notified, but obviously encouraging users to report these things, like I clicked on a phishing link, okay, but I'm actually reporting it. That's a positive thing, obviously negative consequences, but positive that they're letting you know that's the situation, they've identified it. So this takes me into like the first responder side. So, exactly. So obviously, you need to have the information feeding in to your relevant teams, but also you've got to have people who can then be the first responders to do the triaging, and that's so important, because that's the time when you can assess how bad an incident actually is. So are we escalating this straight away to a major incident because we know this is everywhere and we're getting lots of alerts coming in, so that's clearly bad? Or is it something we need to investigate a bit more? What appropriate action are we going to take? How do we triage? And the term triaging is very clear to like your first responders when you to an roadside accident. Your medical professional will go and say, what treatment does this person need? How bad is it? Can I make them stable? Can I contain it? Or if I can't contain it, then I need to move them and get prepared through appropriate treatment at a hospital. It's the same kind of thing. And that kind of leads quite nicely into like that scenario testing. So now we can test the scenarios that we're most worried about. And that leads into like your impact analysis and things like this. So we need to think about all of these things and how the controls we have as an organisation support that incident response process and bring it all together. Now, we talked a lot about the processes, we've talked a lot about the procedures, we've talked about some of the controls you might need to have and some of the things you might need to think about, but ultimately we need to understand what are incidents, right? What actually happens when incidents occur, and how can incidents occur? And of course you could say, it's unauthorized access to our systems, or it's denial of service, or it's some kind of widespread system failure. Realistically, the root causes of incidents are usually from intentional or unintentional acts, so it could be accidental disclosure. I misconfigured my S3 bucket that's now completely open to the internet. Now that's an incident, but it's not a malicious incident until someone takes advantage of that, right? Usually in milliseconds when you have that kind of thing exposed to the internet these days. But the point is, these are things which could lead from either intentional or unintentional acts. It could be actions of third parties. We've seen many third parties that might have been breached that led to other breaches, right? Yep. And that happens quite a lot as well. And actually third party compromise seems to be the topic of conversation for every webinar at the moment, but we're not going to focus on that. But this is something that you need to be thinking about, and this comes back down to the topic that we talked earlier about the threat modelling element in terms of what are the things that we are most concerned about, what is our perfect storm, right? And then actually being able to tie that back to that whole process to say, actually these are things that we really care about, and these are things which are going to cause us the most issue. So if we know that one instance of malware on a system isn't really an issue, but an instance of malware on this particular server here, even though it's one instance, it's our critical server. That's never been updated. It never gets updated. It never gets patched because it's so critical. We won't want to touch it. But if it gets malware, that could take down all our systems, and it could take down like a production line or something like that, right? So, by actually applying context also to those instances, it is really, really important.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I remember back in my other career when I was doing IT support, I was working with an organisation that had a database that was built in Access, and the database could only run on Windows XP. And so the machine could never be updated because the updates had stopped being issued for XP. And at some point, it got to the stage where the Access database needed to be updated. The problem was that the person who'd written the database was no longer contactable for whatever reason. So the business now had a situation where the server that held all of the data records for that business was now unaccessible because it had fallen over. It couldn't be brought back up, and there was no backup for that database. So it goes right back to what we've been saying all the way along, identifying critical assets and putting in place a recovery plan, and then testing that plan in the event that the unthinkable should happen.
This takes us back down to the severity, right? So we talked about the little bits around why incidents happen, but actually we need to know, say we are faced with a potential incident or an adverse event or something like that. How do we actually ascertain what it is? And there's a calculation for this, which we'll talk about in a second. But primarily, we need to understand the severity of incidents, and these vary greatly depending on your classification framework you want to use. But for the purposes of today, we're going to use adverse event, minor incident, major incident, and use the P1 to 3 category. You might have P1 to 5 if you're ITIL, but the point is we're using this to illustrate the point. And so these things could be things such as negative and adverse events and negative consequences, right? They're not necessarily an incident. They could be business as usual events that we see on a regular basis. We might get malware alerts all the time, but it's quarantined, it's fine, it's okay. But actually there could be an early indicator that this is potentially a threat that might be coming. This could be an early indicator of someone trying to target us or trying to attack us. So we shouldn't disregard them, but we should take them as they are. They're an early indicator. It's an early warning signal. Something's a little bit wrong here. We're seeing a lot more malware events than usual at the moment. Is there a lot of phishing emails that we've seen? Did anyone open those phishing emails and maybe their machine didn't have anti-malware, for example, so it gave them, or maybe their anti-malware was disabled or something like this, right? So we need to be thinking about these kind of things, right? Then we're talking about P2. This is your kind of minor incident. This is something which has definitely has impact to the business. It has a minor impact to the business from a confidential integrity or availability. But the important thing to consider here is this is something that can be dealt with by IT or the cybersecurity incident response teams. This is not a problem the business has to solve. It's contained within the IT. So hopefully the business can contain and eradicate without having to notify the executives, but without having to involve the executives in other parts of the business. At the point where you are no longer able to contain it, where you know that customer data has been affected or something like this, this is where you would look to escalate that in terms into a major incident. And this is what's important here, right? So, and of course, a major incident is cross-departmental impact, it's widespread, negative impact to brand damage or immediate risk of that, financial damage, risk, whatever it may be, and critical service disruption. These are things that could massively have a negative consequence and can't be made within IT. Decisions can't be made in IT because now we're talking about a business issue rather than that it's a technically focused issue that now has a negative impact on the entire business, whether that's the ability to trade, the ability for supply chain to be complete, or whatever it may be.
I think in the middle here, the thing that you said that really we need to take on board is that the difference between a minor incident and a major incident is that a minor incident can be resolved within the IT department. It doesn't have to spill over and involve other teams within the organisation. Yes, the CISA has to be notified that it's happened because ideally the head of IT should be a member of the CISA team, so they would be notified by default. But if that incident can be contained by and with the IT team alone, then I think that is a pretty safe boundary from claiming it to be a minor incident.
And there's a bit of science behind this because a lot of times you don't want to be putting your finger in the air and going, well, I think this is a critical incident. I'm not entirely sure, but it might be a critical incident.
It's critical to me.
It's pretty bad, right? My next working week is looking pretty bad. It's critical to my timeline, but not critical to the business, right? So I think it's important to put some science around it and trying to understand and provide some guidance when you're triaging. And the calculation that we like to use is obviously wild plus distribution plus damage equals your severity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's quite important to understand that from a point of, well, how wild is its extent to the threat that, you know, is spreading across the business before detection. Yeah. So if you walk into, we're going to use your scenario in a second, I know you've got a really good analogy for this, right? But if you walk into the incident and suddenly the first time you detect it, when it's like 50 different services have been affected, you know it's pretty wild at that point, and you're dealing with something which is going to be harder to contain. Yeah. If distribution is that actually now it's prevalent across the business, and its speed of distribution is quite high, then that's obviously going to be an issue, like a worm that self-propagates. So every time it infects a server, it replicates and sends itself out to everything. That's a little nightmare scenario that I have dealt with many a times, and please don't want to deal with again for a long time. And then, of course, the damage. What damage and distribution or disruption is it causing to the business? So I know, Steve, you have got a great analogy for this. It really is a good analogy.
I wouldn't say it's a great analogy.
I've built it up now.
But, but I always look at wild distribution and damage, and I always think of it in terms of a fire, because a fire can smoulder, and that to me is the wild section, because before the flames come up, the fire's there, and you don't really start to detect it until you see the flames. The damage that the fire does is where it flattens the building, or it spreads from building A to building B, and that's also the distribution, because now that you've identified that the fire exists, you can look to see the area that the fire is consuming, and you can see the damage that the fire is doing. So I always think of wild distribution and damage in terms of the fire. And if you think of that in terms of malware within an organisation, it can be on one or two devices before you spot it. Once you spot it, are there any other devices? What's the distribution across the business, and how much damage? And when we're talking about damage in terms of cyber incidents, we really should be thinking about how much time is it going to take for me to recover these devices that have been infected.
Or it could be damage to data.
Or damage to data.
Because we see lots of malware that just deletes data.
Yep.
Or, you know, if you look at NotPetya, which I had spent a long time recovering from an organisation, my favourite piece of malware. You know, that was massive. You know, that wasn't deleting data necessarily, but it was just deleting a mass boot file records, inhibiting recovery. Right? So
indeed,
make it very difficult. Right?
And this is the way that we use the severity rating to be able to understand the incident that we're dealing with. So, for example, if we go back to the fire incident and we say that the fire is just within 2 fields, we can say that, well, it's all right, it's just a wild 2. We've understood now that the damage that it's causing is a 4, because it's absolutely obliterating everything within those 2 fields. We can then look at the distribution and say, well, the distribution is contained to just those 2 fields. So we can give the distribution, say, a 2. So we add the 2 and the 4 and the 2 together to give us a figure 8, which means we're actually dealing with a P2 scenario.
It's a P2 fire.
A P2 fire.
There you go. Right, okay. And of course, you know, we talk about triaging. So this is how you bring it all together. And the key thing here is to look at the, you know, how wild is it, which we just talked about, you know, the damage and the distribution. And then when we're looking at your P2 fire, we need to be thinking about, right, we need to raise a ticket. And the key thing here for me is about, do we raise tickets? Do we invoke the plans, whatever it may be? We need to think about all of this stuff. We need to raise a ticket. We need to notify somebody, and we need to log the event. And this, to me, is the point which I think is vitally important.
If I could just jump in there, Stuart, because I think you really glossed over something that needs to be brought out and needs to be focused. Document everything. What happens. So yes, the ticket needs to be raised. There should not be a, do we need to raise a ticket? Yes, a ticket 100%. Needs to be raised. And then if it's determined that no further action is necessary, then document down that no further action is necessary and close the ticket. There shouldn't be a question of, do we need to raise a ticket, in my book.
So one of the things I've found in lots of response, either scenarios or real world ones, is finding someone who is your best note taker, who is your best, you know, your infosec scribe, as I like to call them, right?
Because that's the problem. In the heat of an incident, you're so keen to get and resolve what's happening, to limit the damage to the organisation, that you'll do this, you'll do that, you'll do the other, but you won't have written it down. And it's key, it's so key to be able to write down the steps that you're taking to contain the event, because that, when you're looking at the root cause analysis and the wash-up stage, is what's going to help you to refine and create better plans and better strategies moving forward.
It's much more than that as well. It's also about auditability, right?
Absolutely.
So you need to go back to your stakeholders, internal, external stakeholders,
Yep.
your customers, to say, what did we do?
And this is what we did.
This is what we did.
Yeah.
Here's a log of everything that we did. Right. So having a good InfoSec scribe, and I'm definitely going to use that in the future, right, is definitely the way to go. And actually making sure you've got more people than one person, so you've got compare notes. Ideally, the best ones I've ever seen is they directly enter it into the tickets that have been raised, instant tickets, rather than having notes and having to type it up. That's just more time that's needed. Enter it directly in as you go, and then actually you've got a time log. So every meeting that you have, and this is something we haven't really talked about much, is, you know, how often are you going to meet during an incident? Have that defined in your plan.
I was going to say that should be something that's defined within the plan, and again, the meeting frequency should be directly related to the incident severity. So the more severe the incident, the more frequent the meeting should be.
And then you might have breakout meetings, you should have technical meeting, executive briefing meetings. So this is all the sort of stuff that needs to be considered. Now, I've got this very nice complex diagram on the screen up here at the moment, but I wanted to use this to highlight the fact that incident response is much more than a technical response. That is part of it. So everything up to the CSER can be resolved, and that's kind of everything up to a P2 incident, as you can see. But when you start looking at the crisis management team and other areas of the business, you start to realise that you've got a lot more engagement and a lot more things going on. And it's vitally important to make sure that your executive teams understand their roles and responsibilities, so they can then understand how they fit into this schedule. And your third parties, how they fit into this schedule as well. So we've really got to be thinking about not just this is a technical response, this is a business response to a technical incident. And if you think about it that way, you'll define your approach slightly differently.
Do you think that third parties should be involved in incident response practice and recovery training at all?
It's a really good question, actually. It depends, right? So it depends on what you mean by third parties. If you mean someone who manages your firewalls, it's a third party that manages your firewalls, for example, then I absolutely definitely think they should be involved, because you're going to have to call them. But sometimes it's going to be quite difficult to do that, but you should have as many third parties involved in a desktop scenario, for example, that as you can possibly have. Whether you need to have your third party responders, for example, engaged, well, that's something that I would consider, because ultimately then they will then say what they would do and how they would do it. But the reality is they might not get involved in that, right? So you should, in theory, have all your third parties. If you've got a third party database provider or someone provides your app, and you think that might be part of that process, then you should involve them or make them aware that this is the process, and to make sure they're aware of where their responsibilities are.
Or even if you don't get them involved in your recovery processes, have a good understanding of what their recovery processes are.
What their responsibilities are. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all the kind of stuff that we should definitely talk about, because it is kind of important. And you know, the technical response obviously is a lot deeper and wider, right? So, you know, you're talking about many things. And apologies, it's quite small because it's quite a lot to fit on the screen, but it gives you in a sense that, you know, when you're thinking about recovery and you're thinking about the importance part of how do I get to recovery, the most important part in incident response is containment, right? But before you can contain, you also have to understand the how, the what's, the where, the why, the who. And actually, most people go and say, well, I'm just going to investigate the root cause analysis. How did this happen? I need to understand what the root cause analysis is. My experience of doing incident response is root cause analysis comes out a lot later. Once you're deep into the incident, you've identified all the things that have happened. But you have to split your team into two. You have to have your kind of incident responders who are going to go and do the investigation. So find your best investigators, find your Sherlock Holmes of the IT world and put them into your business and find out they're going to investigate how this happened. And then have your recovery effort team, your containment team, going around and putting out fires and trying to contain it. Because the investigative team will go, you thought they came into the network on Thursday, they came in last month. We found this IP address here that came in. We know that's patient 0, right? And now we need to think about our recovery effort and our containment effort much wider.
But those two activities, they must, I should think, work in parallel.
They are perhaps in parallel, yeah.
It's no point going and trying to understand how things have come into the business if you're not containing the damage that's already there.
You can only contain what you know.
Exactly.
Right? You can just lock everything down. There's one containment. Go the old way of doing it is pull all the cables out your cabinet, and then that's contained.
If only it were that easy.
Oh yeah, I wish it was. But you know, there is that old way of doing it. You can't do that in the cloud. But you know, you can just turn the nicks off, right? But the point is, you can just contain what you know without necessarily affecting the business. Of course, when you're definitely in kind of major incident management mode, the containment actions are very much based on what's the worst case? What's worse?
Yep.
Not containing this,
Yep.
or locking everything down.
And again, going back to the pipeline guys, one of the things that is noticeable is that they isolated the infected machines to contain the damage that happened when they got ransomware last week.
Isolation is the maximum thing to do. The most important thing to do, of course, when you're isolating, keep the machine on, disconnect the network, but keep the machine on so you can use that for investigation later, especially if we're talking about malware that's usually memory resident, you'd lose vital information. But the point is, that's what we look at, and I'm conscious of time. So we talk about test, right? And testing is actually vitally important. So we've done all these great things. We've mapped out our process workflows. We've got all this incident response preparedness training done. We've got our plans. We've got our run books. We've got policy. We've got everything.
Does it work?
Exactly. Does it work? Actually, it's like, and I've got a really good story here, right? And so, I've done, like I said, talked about incident response scenarios, and I did one like many years ago. And we went through the whole process, and I know they had an incident response plan because I'd had a copy of it, right? So I read it and thought, it's pretty good, really good incident response plan. They went through the whole thing, and they went off on a tangent somewhere else, and I brought them all back in, and they responded really well to it. And I just said, so who's got a copy of their incident response plan? And they went, well, are we supposed to bring it in? I was like, well, what's the point? Yes, because it might help with the situation. So if you've got an incident response plan, you might have made different decisions. You might have realised that actually this is how we could potentially contain this, or we might call this team. So if you have an incident response plan, not mean you have to read it page by page and go, we're on point 32 at the moment and we need to do this, but have it there as a guide and make sure you're following the process, because you might miss vital steps.
Because this ties back to what you said right at the beginning of this seminar about the prepared organisation responding in a structured fashion as opposed to the unprepared organisation that responds in a haphazard fashion and can potentially make the scenario 10 times worse.
It's an 811 in most cases, and in some cases it's the Bible and you follow that to the end, right? It depends on which way you're going to go. If you stress tested your process enough and it becomes like business as usual, that's absolutely fine. But how many people have an incident every week?
What sort of tests should we be doing for incident response?
That's a very interesting question. You should ask that. It's like we planned this.
Almost.
Right. Okay. So what's important is we have different types of scenarios, right? And the important thing is that most people will go through some form of desktop scenario, and it's highly recommended if it's your first time doing incident response, you should go through a desktop scenario and you should plan out your worst case perfect storm, right? Because what you want to do is, like any marathon or anything like this, you don't just turn up to a marathon and off you go. I mean, some people do, but then most people would actually have to train and prepare, right? And actually build up to it. So what you want to do is you want to be getting into that kind of fitness training regime where you test your process and your people. And
I have this vision in my head now of people going, right, well, let's infect one machine and see how we deal with that before we infect 5.
Yeah, and it's that kind of thing, right? So it's like kind of saying, well, what's our worst case scenario? And then actually preparing for that and using a simulation, a highly realistic sort of desktop simulation in a safe environment where people are encouraged to ask questions and to challenge other people. And once you do that, you'll also identify where there are gaps in your processes, because obviously no process is perfect, and also no incident response plan or policy is perfect. It needs evolving over time. So you might be like, well, we've changed our system last week, or we decided we're not going to do that, we actually think we're going to do this. You want to update it. But the important thing it will bring out is communication, because there'll be a lot of people in the room that you need to have the executives involved as well as your technical people, and it's how do you translate, how is that information that's coming from the technical team being translated to your executive team, and then how are they then translating that back to the technical team? And if you get that right, you'll be very good at instant response. But because we're not used to these kind of things, it sometimes gets lost in translation, or the information is too technical and the executives don't know how to interpret it. So you've got to road map this, you've got to road test this a little bit before you get it right. The other side of it is obviously we do like, pen testing, and you might want to do some very much more like an attack simulation, like a red team, for example. But that doesn't really test your incident response process. That really tests your controls and how effective your controls are. And of course, you would have an incident response team hopefully detecting and responding to your red team simulation. But the bit that you want to move towards really is what we call like a technical simulation or composite, which is basically a combination of having a technical person delivering an attack against an agreed scenario, and then using that attack to create to see how the organisation responds in a simulated way. So an example is that we would create a bunch of fake accounts and send a lot of messages over social media saying our website had been hacked or something like that in DMs, and that would allow us to then see how the organisation respond from a crisis comms perspective, and then see how they would then respond when we threw a lot of traffic at that website at the same time, see how the technical teams respond, and would they meet in the middle, and how would that incident play out. So it's about as close to a real incident as you can get without being a real incident. And actually that's the best way to test it, but you don't want to walk in and do a technical simulation before you've done and got your processes right.
Yeah. You've done the walkthroughs. I think there was a really pertinent point you said there, that you're doing the tabletop testing and all of a sudden you come to a point, we don't have that system anymore.
Yeah.
So what I take away from that is that organisations need to be updating and keeping on top of their instant response plans whenever they're making a change to whatever system that is embedded within their organisation.
Absolutely, and to add to that as well, you think about your non-technical simulations. So we talked about the technical composite and all this kind of stuff, but actually, really, your first one's going to be a tabletop, right? And it's going to be. It
has to be, yeah.
We need to think about what's the scope, what's the business functions we're going to involve, what systems are we going to look at, what's the threat. What policies, plans, and runbooks do we have? Well, hopefully we've got those. Otherwise, what's the point of testing them?
So this is the foundations that we laid down when we did our asset register, when we did our risk register, when we looked at the threats and the vulnerabilities. It all plays into this.
So think about all those things. If you don't have a plan, and sometimes I know there's absolutely nothing wrong with actually doing an instant response scenario without a runbooks and plans and policies in place. And lots of people do it, and we've done it before. It just identifies the need for that. That's your immediate recommendation. I know before I walk in, I'm going to have to recommend that because you don't have it, but that's fine. But the point is, if you do it and you just want to see how effective you're going to be, that's absolutely fine. But I would recommend having all this stuff in place beforehand because it's going to make it a lot more effective, and it's then a tweaking rather than a build exercise.
Correct.
Which takes me on to things like MITRE ATT&CK framework. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is an incredibly useful resource, especially when you want to think about, well, what scenarios are we most exposed to, or what things should we be looking for. It's an amazing resource for looking at attack paths and attack techniques, and it's constantly updated. Of course, there's some pre-canned scenarios that you can look at as well to see how this actually works.
Fantastic tool if you're going to do threat modelling. If you're sitting there with your assets and you're thinking, well, what can these assets be susceptible to? If you work your way through the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you can say, well, would it be susceptible to, for example, credential stuffing? And then have a look and see what defences there are on the asset, whether or not there are alerts set up that would let you know that somebody is trying to break into that asset.
And if you look at things like PowerShell, is PowerShell enabled on this system? Should it be enabled? Probably not.
Interesting you mentioned PowerShell because the reports are that PowerShell, there was scripting in the ransomware that deleted all of the shadow copies to help to basically disable the backup.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very, very common. PowerShell's a very useful administration tool, but even more useful to attackers, right? So this is one of the things that we will talk about.
Crazy.
But mapping out those detection techniques and how they're mapping out the offensive techniques, how an attacker's going to get in, and then mapping that to your detection capability and your response capability is going to be really important. And this should feed into your runbooks. But giving you an example, you've got ransomware here is a great example. So what are we looking at? The initial compromise. Now, what's going to happen at the exfiltration, the exploitation, the privilege escalation? What commands are we looking at? And I spent some time threat modelling this kind of scenario. What defence evasion are we looking at? Start to map out your scenarios and start to visualise them, because actually you might go, well, this is actually a pretty bad use case. We're worried about this particular scenario. We're worried about this particular ransomware family that uses this kind of command that we know can is known in the wild to evade certain anti-malware technologies, certain EDR technologies. I know a lot of ransomware families are very big on EDR evasion and stuff like this. Endpoint detection and response.
It's amazing how, I hate to say it, but it's really interesting how the bad guys are able to adapt their ransomware so swiftly, because Bitdefender produced an anti-ransomware kit that was able to decrypt ransomware and get systems back online. The attackers understood that this had happened and changed all of the encryption usage within their ransomware, so that ransomware 2.0 was now unstoppable by Bitdefender. Because we're always playing catch up, basically.
Cat and mouse. It always has been. It always will be. And even before Emotep was massively disrupted, the Japanese CERT had released a tool called Emo Hunter, or Emo something. I can't remember what it's called now. I've forgotten the name of it. We talked about it earlier, right? But basically they released it, and it was Emo Hunter. And they released it on GitHub, and literally had all of the file names that have been modified. Just do a search your system, and would say you haven't had these file names modified. So it would look for the directories and the common directories that Emotep would look at, and it would then tell you if you've been infected. And of course, they released this on GitHub. Amazing project, right? And then within 24 hours, they actually changed the whole thing. And then they changed the files, they modified the file names they changed to, and things like this. So it's always constantly updating, and it's so, you're always going to be behind the curve. But, for the last part of this this presentation, I just wanted to take you through some of the things and bring it all together. So we've got a little bit of time here, so we can kind of spend a bit more time on this session. But it's really important to think about this kind of threat modelling, and we're going to use ransomware as a use case. It's topical. It's common, and prevalent. Prevalent, exactly. So we've got all those things covered, right? So for me, it's about looking at all of these things, right? And all of these things in when we're looking at attack vectors. Now, this is why we mentioned MITRE at the beginning, because you can use the MITRE attack framework to start to model out what type of things that someone could look at. And also, we need to think about, in these days especially, we need to think about not just on-premise, we need to think about the cloud. Cloud is going to be a major attack vector for ransomware moving forward, because ransomware isn't just about encrypting data. We need to think about the tactics that have already been deployed by CLOP, by REvil, or Revil if you want to pronounce it that way, depending on your pronunciation of it. That data exfiltration and publicly posting that data is a real thing. So if someone is able to get into your cloud environment through a misconfiguration, and they can get to your data and they can exfiltrate that data because you haven't looked at your outbound connections and you haven't blocked those outbound connections, you are going to be subject to a ransomware attack of a slightly different kind.
Potentially.
Right? Potentially.
Yep.
Potentially. Of course, there are things like data classification you can do and data tagging, but misconfiguration in the cloud is still a big thing. It's still a thing we see all the time. So the point here is that ransomware is evolving. We need to evolve our understanding of it to plan accordingly. So we think about the current things like credentials theft or our authentication keys. I mean, that's a big thing, right? People don't rotate their authentication keys very often, right? In fact, do they or do they? They should, but do they, right? And this is the problem, right? Yeah. I know, there's plenty of GitHub repos that have authentication keys, API keys to them.
I think the thing that really jumps out to me about this slide particularly is that we always think of ransomware as being the result of a phishing attack, the click on an email to download the payload.
Oh, no.
But if we go back to earlier in the presentation, where you were talking about attack vectors, and we were talking about the dwell time, and it's that dwell time that's really significant, because I think that's somewhere in the region of about 280 days, and during that 280 days you've got somebody sitting on the network who's identifying what's going on, and they're sneaking in as business as usual, and they're quiet as anything, so you can't identify them, all the while they're dropping seeds for ransomware. So it's so important to understand and pick up on all the things that are trying to happen across your network.
Baselining.
Always.
But on that point as well, and I think the key thing here is that we're talking also about collaboration. So if we're looking at attack vectors, so backdoor access is one of the big ones, and of course we've got access as a service. So this is a huge market that didn't exist. It existed in kind of silos 3-4 years ago, right?
But even the concept of access as a service indicates that we as security professionals have a hell of a lot to do to actually start making our network secure and being able to identify these breaches. Because if you have the ability to be able to offer access as a service to a bad guy, to a bad actor who can then go and get ransomware as a service to attack you with, we have got a lot of work to do.
It's pre-bundled. I mean, it's pre-bundled. That's what they. So the reason you've got cache,
buy one get one free.
Yeah, you've got cache-rich ransomware groups that are significantly cash rich, right? They can't spend it, so they basically buy access as a service.
Give it away,
they are so they are literally they are creating the market. They are buying the access, and then they are bundling it in. So you basically get ransomware as a service, and if you upgrade, you get access as a service. So you have a ready to made target to go.
There was one ransomware group that decided they wanted to take a Robin Hood approach to life. So they wanted to donate Bitcoin to charities, and the charity said, no, thank you.
No, exactly.
No, we're good.
Yeah, it's all right. It's illegally obtained funds. They're not allowed to, actually. Anyway, this is a whole different topic. Anyway, the point is that you need to identify those things, right? And identify your potential attack vectors, which takes us back to asset management and threat management and all the stuff we've talked about, having a plan, right? And then the next thing in this kind of instance, we need to think about, well, actually, now we've identified those potential risky areas. We need to think about, well, if we did have an incident right now, what are the things we need to check off our kind of the old game like Guess Who, right? It's a bit like that. I just popped into my head, but it seemed like a really good analogy when it just popped into my head. But it is a bit like, so was it phishing? Was it a URL? Was it an attachment? No, it wasn't. Okay, it wasn't phishing then. Okay, it was very strange. Okay, was it, have you got 3389 open? No.
How did it get on our network?
How did it get on our network, basically? And we need to just get on to that kind of Guess Who. And then, of course, we need to think about, well, how would we detect those things? We think it's coming through this way, but we haven't detected it. So maybe there's a gap in our detection, or maybe there's a gap in our preventative controls. And if we rely purely on prevention and we don't invest in detection, that's also a big issue as well, because preventative controls will fail. Okay, at some point. At some point they will. Even when you have the best controls in the world these days.
We had that lock on our front door that we didn't have our camera covering.
Exactly. So, you can invest heavily in prevention. You have to also invest in some form of detection capability, whatever that's, open source, whatever it may be, or managed, or whatever's best for you, but you still need to have the ability.
Something to let you know that the attack has happened.
Correct. Your control has failed.
Yep.
Right?
That prevention has failed.
And so what can we do? Obviously, we've got anti-malware and all this kind of stuff, and mail filtering, and that works mostly of the time. If you've got a good up-to-date policy, you can think about hardening of systems. Network segmentation, vitally important. Let's contain and restrict the breach from going, unless someone's got domain admin, then of course they might be able to get through quite a lot. But the point is, let's segment what we can, physical as well as logical. We've had many conversations about this as well. Least privilege model still works, right? And it's still vitally important, very hard to implement. Okay, I'm not saying that, but it's if you go through your asset management and you go and data flow analysis.
Data flow analysis, and then your access control lists to determine who should have access to these assets, and is it necessary? Do they require it?
And I know this sounds all very good and ideal in an unideal world, right? Because because it's great for us to sit here and say, hey, you just do this and do that. Ultimately, it is hard, right? And if you're a massive multinational, very large corporate, it's not going to be easy, right? But you can start taking bite-sized chunks by focusing on the critical assets and working backwards. We know these are critical assets, so rather than starting, how does someone get to the critical assets, work backwards from the critical assets and work out what can I contain around it and build out theirs.
To be honest with you, Stu, you can do the same thing with your baselining. Just do your baselining around your critical assets to start with. Make sure that the people that should have access are the only people that are accessing it. And so you look at your access logs to see who's logging in and when. Have a look at the ports that are open on those critical assets. Are they the ports that should be open? Do you have a business case for them? And in the same way that you're saying take bite-sized chunks for doing your whole security, your whole preventative, do the same thing for baselining.
Absolutely. And of course, you monitoring, you can use if you're in AWS, you can use their tools to start. They're not perfect, by the way, but they're a starting point. Right?
Is anything perfect?
No, absolutely not. But it's a starting point. Having something in place as a starting point to give you some form of visibility is better than just relying on, I'm going to look at the Windows logs and open up Windows Event Viewer and watch all your computers crash when you do it. But the point is, you need to have something of sending the logs centrally and log storage as well. Make sure if you are.
Well, that's key, isn't it? Because so many times organisations can be breached and the logs can just be overwritten. So you can't then understand and determine what happened to your business because all the logs have been deleted.
Or overwritten because the storage capacity as well. So it's
exchange days long gone.
Yeah, well, that still happens. That's the on-premise stuff. In the cloud, it's not an issue, right? But then, of course, containment. So we think about, okay, We know that there's going to be some form of execution, some lateral movement, some persistence, some privilege escalation. How are we going to contain those things? We need to isolate, disable accounts, block IPs. We need to think about the things that are going to happen in this environment. And there are so many things you can do. But the important thing to remember is, for example, you might want to disable PowerShell and have that disabled where it's appropriate. You might want to restrict access permissions through your identity and access management tools during that containment process and go, look, only these people can access these systems because then we need to be able to do that. There are different ways. Hot fixing. There's been many times, every time I see a ransomware incident, they go, oh, we've got this hotfix patch. If you disable permissions to this file, it stops the ransomware from being able to execute. It doesn't always work, but there's always a hot fix, right? Better to have something preventative, but sometimes you might need a hot fix, right? And sometimes you might need to patch something to stop it from happening. Obviously, we can take the exchange situation with happening really. Everyone actually, literally, there was a 0 day and people were patching and still being affected because literally Microsoft announced there was a patch and then the attackers had already run rampant. Yeah. So you'll see patching isn't always a solution. Hardening systems, however, that's different, right?
But then when you say that patching isn't always a solution, regular patching
is. I'm not. By the way, just to clarify, I'm just saying that
And again, I with my GRC hat on, I say that organisations should have their patching policies in place, and this should all again tie into your asset management, because you've identified that one of the weaknesses with your assets could be the fact that we're not updating the underlying operating system or whatever it may be, and this can be cured by making sure that we have a regular patch process in place.
But there's always the issue of the exception to the policy, because it's like we can't patch that, because if we patch it, everything goes down. Like, there's always going to be that one system that you can't patch.
But then, if you have that system within your organisation, is it actually beneficial to you as a business, or should you be looking at a way of removing that to harden your organisation?
It's a question that I really would like to answer. But I can't, because it's not my system. But I would like to be able to
answer. These are the questions that businesses should be asking themselves.
Absolutely, and there are some cases, and I know of, and I can't talk about any of these, but I know of some cases where they really want to do that, but there is no way of doing it at that moment in time, and it might be that we need to wait a year to do that. But there might be some companies, the systems are so critical they have to wait 12 months to update it.
And this is where we go back to that slide where we were looking at the external threats on the business, such as the technological threats, because you've got a technology that's putting your business at risk, but you can't update it or you can't remove it because there's nothing on the market to replace it.
Absolutely. I'm just conscious of the last few minutes before we get to questions, but eradication, right? So this is quite important. Like, there's a time to eradicate and there's a time to not eradicate, and this is really interesting because if you haven't fully contained everything, by eradicating the threat, you're tipping off the adversary, but also, and they could deploy more countermeasures to make it worse, but also if you haven't fully eradicated, and you do, it might actually reinfect your systems by doing that in the same place. And there are certain kill switches and things like this that attackers have to kind of stop you from doing that. But what's interesting is, you need to identify the infected service. Please do take a dirty snapshot of the infected systems because it'd be useful for forensics, but also do clearly label that dirty snapshot as something that is malicious, and please do not run ever in the entirety and don't store in your network, because you might find that one person double clicks it and goes, what's this? And you have an incident, right? So make sure you get rid of that. Obviously prep for forensics. If you're at the stage when you're eradication and you haven't actually checked your backups, haven't been affected, it's probably a bit late. So at this stage you should be prepping backups, but confirm your backups. The first thing I would want to be doing is when we have an incident of any type is, are our backups okay? And make sure they haven't been...
Are the backups safe?
Are the backups safe? Is the integrity of the backups okay? Have we got another incident to deal with? And if so, what do we need to do? If the backups are okay and you've confirmed the integrity of the backups, then of course you want to be prepping for backup because we're moving to the next stage. Obviously you want to do things like changing passwords, permissions as well, because ultimately you had an incident, and in most cases that's an issue with permissions. In some cases we both agree that it could be the permissions in the first place were the issue because it was a privileged account that was compromised. But we've got that kind of thing. You need to think about these things. Remove any malicious artifacts that you identify. These are things which fresh rebuild in most cases. And then recovery. One thing that I want to point out across the whole of this process, that is the 2 points actually that are important, but the first one is situational awareness. You are at risk during an incident, especially when you're at the end, of being attacked again. Attackers will know at that point you've got them off the network, and they're going to try everything they can to target you again, because they know you're in this heightened sense of we're focusing on getting back to normal. Yeah. They will try and get you again. So be aware that you might be targeted again by a different group or by the same group. And also, there's the other side of things as well, that everyone overreacts to business as usual type alerts. So there's a malware alert, oh no, we're under attack again. Don't overreact, but just take the appropriate action, investigate it. Okay, this is normal.
This is where you go back to triaging, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you determine the wild, the distribution and the damage.
Stick to the process.
Yeah.
Don't overreact. We're not under attack. I have another story I'll talk about maybe another time, where I was responsible for all the phishing emails that came into my inbox, and I got 10,300 emails in a week at the end of an incident, because there was a whole thing that went on, and I had to go through them all. That was not a fun week. Anyway, so recovery, data integrity check, make sure you've got that, check for new activity, testing new controls. Hopefully you've changed things since you've had the incident, otherwise you're going to have the same thing again. So you've made improvements as you're going through the incident, you've resolved it, and vitally, most importantly, wash up root cause analysis. How did this happen? How can we stop it happening again? What can we do to improve? Do we need to invest in new technology, new controls, new processes? Update the incident response plan, the process, the procedures, if required. If required.
And again, that whole wash up and root cause analysis should be driven by the notes that have been taken by the people responding and resolving the incident during the course of the incident's lifetime.
So, we have reached the part of the presentation where we're going to talk about Q&A. So, before I do that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending and staying with us for the last 90 minutes. Almost 90 minutes. There are 9 to go. But most importantly, I'd like to say that this is a monthly thing we're doing. So if you've enjoyed this, please attend the next one, which is on the 9th of June, which is about security training for developers. And also, like I said, there are many, many more of these coming up. So please check out our Eventbrite page for more information about the future events that we have on ZeroDayLive. Amy is going to be sending out a PDF with the instant response preparedness service that we offer, and please look at that, because there might be things we've talked about today that might be of interest, and you might want to see how we can help with those things, whether it's scenarios or preparedness, whether it's the kind of instant response review services that we offer. But also, vitally important as well, we've got a white paper that we've written that will support this on threat modelling for instant response preparedness. So please check that out. It's going to come out fairly shortly, so you'll be able to see that. And I guess we're going to hand over Steve with his Surface Pro to take any questions we have today.
So the first question that I've got here is somebody's asking, how often do I need to update my incident response plan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that was from, I think I mentioned this a bit earlier on, but I'll talk about it again, is, you want to update your incident response plan, obviously post an incident, because that's a vital time to do it. You want to do it at the site there's a major change in your organisation. So there's a major technical change or process change or people change as well. And then also review it annually. So, you want to be doing it as frequently as possible. If you've had an incident response scenario, you might want to do it then as well.
And I have another question here. If an incident is missed on the log, will that affect the business?
Ooh, that's a blinding question. I'd need to know more about that. But
it depends on what that incident is, isn't it?
Yeah, really? It does. I mean,
it's context.
It's context. Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer, but it could do. Yeah, I mean, it's important to have everything logged from an auditability point of view as well. As long as you've responded to that incident, and you can then retrospect, if you've not had it in an incident like ticket, for example, but you've got notes, and then you can retrospectively say that's what we've done, I think that's okay. But if it's been missed altogether, that's probably that's a process that needs to be updated, right?
That's a fair enough answer. There's one here, somebody's asking, how do I identify my assets? And as I've been banging on about...
That's a Steve question there, I'm going to dodge that one.
Been banging on about assets, I think I'll take that one. So as we said, assets are anything that is of value to the business, and they can be physical, tangible, intangible, or informational data assets. And the best way to be able to identify assets, in my opinion, is to start with things like data flow diagrams to understand how the information is coming into your business, understand what is being used to process that information. So, for example, if you receive an email, this becomes an asset because the email's coming into here, the data held within that, is it worth protecting or is it just general garbage? And then you can make these determinations by using things like data labeling, information classification, and understanding what is being stored on which assets and where. So, for example, the filing cabinet that may hold all of your HR records, should that be in the HR room or should that be in a separate cabinet, in a separate cupboard under lock and key with restricted access? It's about understanding what has value to your business.
I think to add to that as well, the asset register is obviously really important, but also that you're going to have data lakes.
Don't start.
But you're right though, right? Because this is the question that I get asked a lot as well. And you're going to have maybe like 4 or 5 different assets. You might have a centralized system that basically does asset tagging, which is great, and you've got a starting point. You might have a spreadsheet over here that's got all the domain names that you own, and actually you might have another one that has all the domain names that you didn't realize you own because they haven't brought them together. The problem with asset management is that you're going to have data all over the place about your assets in different systems. The first part is to understand, where do we have information about our assets that we can use to build an asset register and then work out an asset register
and
to work
then
out where the
decide
gaps.
who owns it.
Absolutely.
Who is in charge of those assets.
And I think that's a good starting point.
Here's one I think that you'll enjoy.
Okay.
How do I protect my business against phishing?
It's a really good question. So, first point. Okay, there's 2 ways, right? The first one is good training, and everyone goes, well, CBT training is quite useful, and it is quite useful, right? But you need to have good training in place, good education, and regular education and training, and then think about phishing simulations. Now, doing phishing to protect from phishing is a weird concept, but actually understanding your phishing resilience. And what I'm talking about here is not how many people clicked on the phishing email, but how many people reported the phishing email. That's the measurement to understand your resilience, right? Now from there you can start to build out programs making it easier for people to report. The problem is you can never actually ever really stop phishing. You can have the best you can have the best AI, machine learn driven, best whatever it may be to detect phishing attacks. But if one gets through and someone clicks on it, it doesn't really matter. It's what happens when someone clicks on it or opens it or does whatever. So you need to have good defense and depth and controls. You need to have a good process and easy for people to report, and people feel they can report those phishing emails without some form of reprimand or something like that. Because also, if you create a culture where people are encouraged to report them, it helps you detect and respond, react, and recover quickly. Obviously, 2FA is great, but if we're talking about ransomware, obviously that's a slightly different subject. But importantly, you need to be thinking about, what controls do I have to prevent malware and the malicious controls, and what controls do I have to prevent against the credentials phishing? So they're 2 different types of things.
And again, I think something you said in amongst there was encourage people to come forward, because this is what we were saying earlier when we were talking about security incidents. It's really important that people are encouraged to report security incidents, even though they may consider them inconsequential.
Well, I had a scenario a while ago, an actual real world one, where someone actually had clicked on a phishing email it was sent to their personal account whilst logged into a work machine. It was also a shared device as well, so it's even worse. And that had generated a ransomware attack that had propagated quite far through the network. They'd then closed that down, logged out, left it, didn't report it, came back the next day, realised it caused a major issue, and then finally reported it. But the problem is there was a dwell time of so much longer, they couldn't work out the root cause. If they had reported it straight away, they would have been given the right advice to disconnect that from the network and then reduce the spread of the ransomware. So encouraging people to report, regardless of how bad it is so vitally important, because the quicker someone reports, your technical controls might pick it up anyway, but if someone comes and says, it was me and this is what I did and this is what happened, at least you have time to respond and recover. So it's actually quite important.
Well, there's nothing else on my magic tablet at this point.
Thank you then. That's great. So 90 minutes. Thank you very much. Again, we're going to send out a white paper. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, thank you, Stuart.
I'll thank myself, but I can't. But no, seriously, it's been really good. And thank you for joining us on this journey. We're looking forward to seeing you all next month. And again, like I said, if you want to know more information about this, about incident response preparedness, you know, we have a PDF that we were going to send you.
And it's really about sort of making sure that you've got your pre-breach actions in place, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Incident response preparedness is all about, you know, making sure that you are ready, trained, your team are prepared, and your organisation understands responsibilities. If you get those bits right, it's an easier step forward. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.